Matt had graduated from Stanford High School not too long ago and wanted to go to college in New York. He and his two best friends who graduated made the decision to move and rent one large apartment for the three of them. Matt's parents wanted him to stay and tried to convince him that Stanford was also an opportunity to get a good education, but the guy wouldn't even listen. This is understandable, because many teenagers after school hurry to leave for the big city. Matt packed his things and called his friends, Bud and Calvin, to warn them that he was ready to leave. But the boys were having a little trouble with their parents too. If Calvin had managed to come to an agreement with his parents finally, Bud's mother had thrown a tantrum and threatened him that he would only leave home over her dead body. Matt knew the woman well. Her husband had died when her son was still very young and she had to raise the child on her own. She didn't give herself any privacy, convincing herself and others that Bud was her privacy. She didn't need any other. Even though Bud had tried to prepare his mother for his departure before, she wouldn't even listen. His friends are here to support Bud, especially since their bus was leaving in an hour and a half and they needed to hurry. Just as they were entering the house, his mother screamed that she would curse her son and his friends if he dared betray her. Matt remembered well that there was a rumor going around town that his mother was crazy about magic and spells. At least she'd told everyone that she had a family of witches. And no one was surprised by her claims. In the end, they couldn't convince her, and Bud said that if she didn't let him go now, he'd leave anyway, but he'd never talk to her again, and she could try to curse him all she wanted. The woman exhaled and went to her room. She came back with an old button phone and told Bud to use it. The boy grinned and said it wasn't serious, since it didn't even have internet on it. But the mother was adamant. The boy decided it was best to agree. But before giving the phone to her son, the woman raised it to her lips and began to whisper something, then held it out to Bud. He took it, threw his backpack on his shoulder, hugged his mother goodbye and left with his friends. The boys ran to the station, because they had lost a lot of time, but by some miracle they managed to jump on the bus when the driver was about to close the door. They sat down and exhaled. Calvin laughed and said that Bud's mother was certainly a funny woman. Matt and Calvin made a few more jokes about his mother along the way, and Bud didn't mind. Sometimes he could make a joke about it himself. When they got to the station, Calvin spread his arms and shouted a welcome to his freedom and new life, and the others did the same. They knew where to go, as the guys had found an apartment beforehand and made arrangements with an agent. After arriving at the apartment and handing over the necessary amount of money, Matt immediately collapsed on the couch and started throwing around ideas that it should be celebrated and get well drunk. No one argued. Bud went to the room he had chosen for himself and began to sort through his things. He pulled out the cell phone his mother had given him and shoved it into the very last drawer of the desk. Of course he wasn't going to use it. In the evening the guys went to the club and had already gotten to know the girls. While Bud was sitting next to one of them, she offered him to write down her number and meet up sometime. She said that she lived with her mean aunt who would tell her parents if she didn't come home for the night. While Bud was writing down the number, his mom called him, but he cursed and dropped her call and asked the girl to say the number again. The girl left and Calvin suggested that his friend find Bud another one. After all, it wasn't fair, since he and Matt had already found some entertainment for the night. Bud refused. He really liked her and counted on their further communication. This night Bud didn't sleep very well, but not because his neighbors had a rough night, but because he had a dream about his mom. In the morning he decided to call her back, making up an excuse as he went along, but surprisingly she didn't pick up the phone. During the day he tried to call her, but no one answered at the other end. The guy got worried and called a woman who lived in a neighboring house and sometimes came to visit. He asked her to come over and check on his mother and see how she was doing. A couple hours had passed since that call, but no one had called back. Bud had already decided to dial the neighbor again and ask her if she had checked on his mother when the phone rang. Bud answered the call. Throughout the phone conversation, Calvin and Matt had seen their friend's face change, and it expressed intense concern. After Bud took the phone away from his ear, he was silent for a while. Matt was about to get up and bring his friend to his senses when he spoke. Bud said his mother had died. When their neighbor went and rang the doorbell, no one opened it for her. After going around the house and looking in the windows, she didn't see anyone either and no one answered her knock. So she decided to call the police. The police told her that maybe the person had just left or gone to the store and it was not worth calling them for nothing. But the woman said that she lived in a neighboring house and if someone had gone out, she would have seen it. Still, she managed to convince the police to come. When they picked the lock and entered the house, they saw the woman. Her veins had been slit and a pentagram-like circle had been drawn around her with blood. Matt said that the guy had to get back right away and he absolutely had to attend the funeral. Calvin said they would go with him. A few weeks later, the boys returned back to town. Bud was upset about his mother's death, but life didn't end there. His friends dragged him out to the same club to unwind. Bud agreed. He really wanted to meet that girl, as he hadn't found her number in his contacts, although he was sure he had written it down. While they were sitting in the club and drinking, Bud noticed a familiar figure among the people. He recognized her at once and hurried in that direction. The girl recoiled from him and told him to stay away from her and called him crazy. The guy asked what was the matter. She looked at him in surprise and answered that if for him calling at night and silence in the phone is nothing serious, then he's a total psycho. Then the girl turned around and disappeared into the crowd. Then Bud pulled out his cell phone and checked his outgoing calls. There was no call from him. And how could he call if he didn't even know the girl's number? Matt said he was lucky she blew him off. After all, his friend noticed right away that she was kind of dorky, but he decided not to tell him right away so as not to upset him. Some time later they saw an article in the news about the death of a local college student. The guys recognized her as the girl from the club who had killed herself by taking pills. Matt once again confirmed what he'd said about the girl is crazy. Bud was a little shaken by this, because it's not every day that you start being surrounded by the deaths of people you know and care about. That night Calvin decided to throw another party for his friend. He literally poured alcohol in Bud, and even in a drunken frenzy threw out the phrase that he was surrounded by crazy women. The guy did not like this statement, but he decided that it was worth keeping silent, because Calvin had arranged all this for him. After a while the doorbell rang, and Calvin, saying that there was a surprise for Bud, went to open the door. In the living room appeared a lady dressed rather vulgarly. Matt and Bud immediately realized that the guy decided to invite a representative of the oldest profession. Calvin literally pushed Bud and the girl into the room and closed the door. The next morning, when Matt woke up, he met Bud in the hall. Turns out they didn't have a long fun time and the girl left after an hour. As far as Matt knew, though, Calvin had paid for the whole night. Bud asked him not to tell him that he had escorted the girl out so quickly. Matt nodded, and that's when the sleepy culprit of the celebration appeared in the hall. Calvin told Bud that the phrase, having fun, means not calling all night and not saying anything. Bud thought for a second, then said he didn't have time to get his phone out of the living room yesterday. Especially if he had accidentally called Calvin, he would have obviously heard the appropriate sounds, not silence in any way. The guys checked the outgoing calls on Bud's phone, but there were no outgoing calls there this night. Then Calvin pulled out his phone and showed everyone the calls from Bud, some of which were missed. No one had any idea what was going on, but decided not to emphasize it. In the evening, when the guys came home from studying, they noticed that one was missing. Calvin had apparently gotten held up. Bud offered to call, but Matt replied that he was not his mommy to find out when he would be home. Most likely the guy had found a girl to stay with for the night or evening. No one showed up the next morning, but Matt again did not pay much attention to it, and Bud did not worry, knowing the character of their friend. In the evening, after university, they came home alone again. Matt was sitting and reading the news on Facebook, and Bud said they should call Calvin. Matt just nodded. As Bud dialed his friend, Matt's expression changed dramatically and his eyes were ready to jump out. Unable to reach Kelvin, Bud asked his friend what he saw there. Kelvin forwarded the Facebook post to Bud's private message without comment. Bud opened the message and began to read. It said that the body of a young man had been fished out of the Hudson River today. According to preliminary reports, the lad killed himself, as no signs of violence were found on his body. The guys sat in silence for about half an hour, staring at their phone screens. No one could believe that it was suicide. Kelvin was a cheerful man, and those who were suicidal he despised and called sick. A little later, Matt got a call from the police saying that he was invited for questioning, and so was Bud. Apparently Calvin's parents had told about the fact that the guy had been living with them all this time and the guys would be the first to be questioned. In the morning they sat in the station and answered the standard questions, namely what the guys were doing at the time of death that day, how long they had known the deceased, whether they had noticed any suicidal thoughts, but both answered that Kelvin just couldn't kill himself. After questioning, both were released home. Although Kelvin's parents suspected that one of his friends might be involved, the police had no reason to detain him. Bud sat on the couch and couldn't believe what was happening. Matt said that maybe they were really cursed by his crazy mom. Bud didn't like that statement and replied that he shouldn't say that, but Matt was obviously on edge. The guy got up, went to Bud's room, got his mother's cell phone and walked with it toward the window. Bud stopped him and told him to calm down. He couldn't really believe this nonsense. Matt replied that he was ready to believe anything already, pushed Bud away, opened the window and threw the phone out. Matt suggested to his friend that if he wanted, he could go look for it on the street, but Bud shook his head. That phone really didn't have much value to him. Even though it was a memory of his mother, it was a bad memory of the day she had yelled that she would curse them all. The next day when Bud was getting ready to go to school, he didn't see Matt in the hall, even though he had to go out soon. He decided to go into the room and hurry his friend up. When he opened the door, he was shocked to see his friend hanging from a noose in the middle of the room. It had been a few days since Matt's body had been taken away. Bud had already packed his things to move out of that nightmarish apartment that reminded him of what had happened, but as he was leaving the apartment, he was met by the police. They had good reason to detain the guy. The numbers of all the guys, including that girl, had received calls from Bud's cell phone just the day before they died. They demanded to see his phone. The guy didn't hesitate to give it to them. But they found nothing on it, no calls on those dates. Then they showed the search warrant and entered the apartment. 15 minutes later, a policeman appeared from Bud's room with the phone in his hands. Bud was surprised. He was sure Matt had thrown him out on the street that day. Bud replied that he didn't know how the phone had gotten to him, as it had been broken by a dead friend. But there's no way any calls could have come from this phone, as it wasn't even turned on and it didn't have a SIM card. But the police had a different opinion about it. In the phone, they found outgoing calls to the numbers of all the victims on the day of death. What's more, they found messages that had been sent to them just minutes before they were killed. Each message contained calls for death. Bud was detained and sent to solitary confinement. Now the police had grounds to detain the guy pending trial. Only he wasn't alone in that prison cell. His mother was with him.